What is the backlash to prevention? Has it changed over time? And what do you think the origins of it are?
I think it has changed over time, and I think it will continue to change over time. Fundamentally, I believe that when you start to make progress, people that really don't want to see those social changes or don't really believe that there's a problem will push back. So I think, independent of what you're dealing with, that we'd be better off, instead of being derailed by backlash, planning for it. So our first phase, in some ways very early on and smaller, was the kind of pushback that if we start talking about sexual abuse at all to children, we're going to make them terrified of all of those different things. The second wave was from the research that especially put a chill out about anything with preschool. It was any education. I think each time there's been a visible book, article, piece of research against what we're doing, it tends to get much more attention than the research that has been supportive or anything that speaks to the positive. So we need to ask ourselves why that happens. Part of why that happens is news loves the controversy and likes to make a controversy. But part of that is people wanting to deny and to minimize the reality of sexual abuse.
How much do you think that sort of conservative views of the role of women plays into the backlash?
I think that always plays into it because there's such a connection along this continuum of sexual violence throughout the ages and the objectification of women, our gendered norms, our hyper-gender norms that are destructive all the way through that play into the evolution of development of sexually harmful behaviors, the vulnerability to victimization, and the not taking it seriously enough. Who's got the privilege to do the harm and who do we not care about if they're harmed?
So mothers belong in the home protecting kids, not out in the workforce.
And protecting a father if they are accused and keeping the family together.
So how do you deal with those sort of deeply held cultural values that underpin not just objection to sex abuse prevention, but also probably play into not wanting to fund prevention efforts?
Well, I'm one of those that is not a conflict avoider. I believe we need to name them. People may not always agree, and some people believe in the naming them in a very direct way. I think there's ways to do that with radical outrage, and we need those voices. There's also ways to understand the fears and the frustrations and beliefs and just say, and for example, I recognize that a lot of you believe, or we often hear when you're repeating the statement, but I want to add a different perspective to that. Because I think sometimes the beliefs are very conscious, and I think sometimes they're more unconscious or subconscious. If we're not calling that out, it's hard to know what we're working with to try to change.
Interesting. Another thing you sort of talked about was the individual education versus sort of risk management protocols and policies, and then broader social cultural change. How do you think of the relative importance? Because there seems to be an attitude that we can't do all.
I think that's the problem, is that in the trying to minimize prevention, in the inadequate resources for prevention, in the not really believing prevention's relevant or work, it's just a nice idea like mom and apple pie, but not something really doable. We want to get it down to just give me the one thing so I can check off the list. So we've done 1 hour of education in every grade, so now we're done. And so I think even when you talk about individual education, there's an issue of how comprehensive it is. But all the way through, I think we've got to understand what we've learned from any other prevention strategy, that there are pieces of all of those that are needed and relevant. And it's hard to do one without the other and do it and make it be comprehensive and meaningful.
And you talked in your lecture about really a history of very creative ideas. Some have changed over time, but some really good ideas about how to approach a broad view of prevention. How do we target taking these really good ideas and getting them more into the community and more accepted?
Well, I think one thing that's going to be a good news about technology is we need to use those strategies to get information out a lot more, to get people engaged a lot more, to reach people who aren't going to come out to a training or out to a presentation, or where schools are blocking the education, or it's just not as effective. I think technology gives us a lot of potential. As you know, I've also always been a firm believer in the arts, and that may not sound or land right academically or professionally or research-wise, but my reason for saying that is I believe in a lot of different ways that arts can reach people in their messages through the music, through the poetry, through the writing, through theater, through dance. There are, through sculpture, through art, in the expression a person can make to tell their own story, and we know stories matter. Facts are important, but we can debate facts, and stories get to our heart, and then we need to back it up with the research and facts. And theater can really help that. Theater can, or all the arts can help engage the community, can help be an event. So it's not an end of it in and of itself, but I think it is an overlooked piece of the puzzle a lot. And we've dappled in it in a lot of different ways in prevention, but really engaging those voices is another opportunity.
How do we go, or how do we help people go beyond being amazed or shocked or interested in the stories to then putting that into some action?
You always need to pair it. So when I hear a story or tell a story, there's also a so what and what. So what can you do? How does this relate to you? Because I don't want to, when I'm doing a story or telling my own story or using an art form or whatever it is, it's not only so you feel that or so you're aware of the problem, although a lot of our early efforts focused on that. It was, what does this mean to you and what can you do about it and how can you be engaged?
In some ways, although I like the term safety education is also a way of not talking about it. So can you talk a little bit about how we talk to various groups, especially maybe religious groups, about how sex abuse prevention and sexuality are linked?
Well, we know language matters. So this is going to sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my brain or mouth or heart, but I think there are times that if safety education works better, great. But I think ultimately if we want to move people forward, we need to model how to talk about this. And I have found a lot of people don't do it, not only because of belief systems, but they don't know how. There were many times we would do shows for children and people would come up afterwards going, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you answered that question when it came up because I didn't know how I would do that. And it's not as hard as they thought. The other shift is if there's any good news, and I say that in quotes, with the incredible access to pornography now to children, is that I've heard more people that have been incredibly against sex education that realize they don't want pornography to be the primary education of their children. And even if their children aren't seeing it, they recognize there's a secondhand effect, that other kids are getting ideas and attitudes that aren't perhaps as protected or isolated as they manage to keep theirs if they do. So I think that's opening up people to say, wait a minute, we need to do a better job of giving another way to talk about this. We're not all going to talk about it in the same way. And maybe the education I get about it within my faith community is different than what I get in the school, is different than what I hear from another program, but they're all pieces of the puzzle.
You mentioned pornography. Is there any such thing as safe use of pornography?
This is a hot debate in our field, and we'll see when people are watching this 20 years from now if we have a different answer in research. But currently, research also it has all different kinds of things. It says based often on how they're asking the questions that they're asking and what they're looking at. I think that the issue to me is that pornography is defined by the industry, and the content of that pornography is problematic not only because of the content, but because of the access and the way technology works on our brains and connecting with it more than human beings and so on. And key part to your is anything safe is that they've totally taken over saying that that's sex. So it's like they're equated now. Right. So we need to take it back. We need to take back our sexuality. One of the problems along with that is we don't have access to accurate, loving, beautiful, caring, connected, fun, hot, erotic images. Even erotic has been taken over by the pornography industry. And so we don't have alternative images, especially if I grew up in the technology age. And in a time where the media got so hypersexualized. Yesterday's porn is today's mainstream media. So how do I even come up with an image of sexuality that is not pornified if that's all I've ever seen?
Is.
And again, it goes, when you think about prevention, our strategy is so we're trying to educate people about the harms instead of doing anything about the toxic flow, instead of holding the companies accountable that are profiting from this, and trying to look at some way, again, we just don't have so much to overcome. And we don't have an alternative narrative to their dominance.
But do you have any other ideas what we can do to be more welcoming and recognize really the value of survivor leadership?
I still think there's this kind of standing norm or practice that if you're a survivor, you're not really supposed to talk about it, or would somehow take away from that you're a professional. So, and in other ways, color your ability. And we say we're trauma informed, and we say that's really important, and yet what many talk about is you're a survivor and everybody's saying how trauma informed they are, but if you demonstrate any of your trauma, then it shows you don't have a right to be in a leadership position. And so it's ridiculous. It's like we have to, if we're really trauma informed, then we have to also make space for what that looks like, because it doesn't mean somebody can't not only do the job, but lead in the field. And then also I find that people who aren't survivors feel very threatened. You know, it's easy to feel threatened, like, well, what about me? Then I don't have a role, and da-da-da-da. And it's like, yeah, and what have we been doing? How do we make space for each other? And what does it really mean to be an ally? And how do we do a better job of training, of bringing in, not marginalizing? I mean, how many places would have like a survivor there on the board, or will have a panel, but let us pros do the work, which that is really part of, we don't come out and say that, but we do a lot of marginalizing of that. We'll bring you in to do the workshop to speak about your experience. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is the incredible competency, courage, and leadership of survivors, and I think that's very important. And working not only side by side, but seeing in all different kinds of positions, not just the storytelling narrative, which is, I don't mean to minimize that, not just the here's who I am and here's the harm, but also how they're engaged in social change and leadership.
Yeah, there's kind of a dissociation that we are interested in survivors, and yet we do sort of split them off in
we
many
study
ways.
You.
Yeah.
We treat you.
Yeah.
We fix you,
yeah.
As opposed to we are, and we hear your stories and we learn from you. But that's very different than being led by, or really what does it mean to be an ally? Really what does it mean to have you be significant leaders in the field? Some survivors would argue that the only people who could be leaders are survivors. And others would say, no, we need us all in this in different ways, but we've got to get over this us and them and marginalization and devaluing.
There's a wonderful quote by an analyst, Lucia Tower, who says it was never expected that anyone would be so well analyzed as to be without neurotic conflict. And this goes back to your early days in the field. Not only have we sort of separated victims from professionals, but have we also kind of ignored the sexual development of professionals?
Absolutely. I think that in this field, we not only have all our exposure to trauma, so we're dealing with the secondary trauma and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, but a key part when we're doing this is what is the impact on our sexuality when most of what we're hearing about, thinking about, reading about, and studying is sexual harm, abuse, exploitation, and coercion. What is that like when you go home? And how is that different if I'm advocating for treating victims versus advocating, or not advocating for, but treating or researching or understanding those who've committed sex offenses? And no matter what it is, if this is all my time, and I see the harm, and I see this toxicity, and I see all these harmful beliefs, how do I go home and also stay positive? How do I have space, time, and energy left in that positive? Can I see anything positive? Do I see everything is shaped by the patriarchy and privilege and power? And there are a lot of ways, there are some truth to that. But so how do we take back and claim our sexual selves and talk about that? Because the other part is we can act out as professionals too. have. You know, it does affect us. And it may affect us by shutting down or just not having energy left, or just not even like, how do I even have space for that? Or acting out in other ways and destructive. And again, that may be because I didn't have time to keep a relationship healthy. I didn't have energy. Or I was working with people that were looking at training investigators who have to look at child sexual abuse images all the time and the effect that has on them. And when you're looking at that, there's a very toxic effect. And studying, you know, you're seeing actual images of a child being sexually abused. You're probably hearing it. And I remember one person who talked about, and then the person who made the tape also put music to it. And it happened to be the music that he got married to. So on his anniversary, instead of that being a positive, it was completely destroyed for him in any pleasantness. Or, you know, do we get, so I think what's left with intimacy when you've been hearing this and seeing this, and how do you transfer? We have to be pretty conscious about it, and I believe we need to be conscious about a positive input.
So it's more than self-care. It's awareness of how this current life impacts our development. But I thought I heard you also talking about the importance of recognizing how the same messages that condition everyone in society also condition the professional.
I think that's much better said than I said it. That's absolutely true. We're all affected by this. So there are many times throughout my career, and I have many more to go, I've bumped up against my own biases, my own prejudices, my own lack of understanding, my own limited views, or where I was very comfortable in my lane because I knew it and went, yeah, I need to expand that lane. I need to cross off that lane. I need to make another turn. You know, it's a good news and a bad news that we all keep learning and we all keep growing. This isn't an area where you know the field. There's there's things we know, and there are truths, but there are always new pathways, and partly because society is changing us around us, and it changes some of the dynamics. The technology boom is a huge example in our field of issues, of possibilities, and of problems we never imagined.
So some of us are survivors, and some of us may have done inappropriate things in the past. Some of us have biases. The important thing, if I hear you, is to really kind of identify them and, in a sense, apply the same notions of restorative justice to how we think about our own development.
I think that's true. I think that part of it is that it's easy to get stuck in our shame, and then we're in denial because we don't want to admit that we did anything wrong, and we're human beings, we make mistakes, and we don't know everything, and we learn and we unlearn and we change. And very often we're transformed because we've heard somebody else's story. You know, like the ways we're trying to change other people, you meet somebody and go, oh, my biases, I see my bias now. And I see where that truth wasn't the truth that I thought. So we're unlearning in the way we know when we're trying to educate people that they have to do. It's just harder because I think the myth as a professional is somehow I'm supposed to be above it all. I'm not going to be victimized. I'm not going to be duped by somebody. This is very hard for me on a very prestigious national expert panel when all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but we realized that the person representing the major program that we were all advising was was investigated and found out to be involved in child pornography, child sexual abuse images. Preventionists, victim advocates, investigators. How did we not see this? Researchers, how did we not know? Well, you know, you're interacting with a person in a different way now, but we can learn from that. Why didn't we know? What didn't we ask? I think that it's really hard. It's really hard when it's a colleague who is the person who has the problematic reasons that stops people from coming forward is it's so hard to hold both truths, that this person could do this really bad thing and also do a lot of great things. So we've got to, and that's why the person first language is so important in this field. I've tried hard, but I'm sure I've missed to not say sex offender, but a person who committed a sex offense, a person who was victimized. It's not our whole identity. You know, in that case, a bad thing, horrible traumatic thing happened to you, or you did a horrible traumatic thing, but you are more than that because we want you to not do it again, and we want you to thrive.
Well, you've given us a great gift. When you were going through the history, I was just struck by how the history of sex abuse prevention is really your personal professional history. You're as positive now as you were umpteen years ago when I first met you. You've been really a passionate voice for survivors, but also different perspectives for looking at prevention. And so on behalf of everybody who benefits from the leadership you've exhibited, I want to thank you for your service, and thanks for visiting the Joshua Center.
Thank you.